All right, so we have three social media experts here with us today to talk to us about their unique experiences and expertise in using social media professionally. We have Kristen Tim, communications researcher at UAF. We have Sarah Eckert, communications specialist with NSF, and we have Alice Glenn of the Alaska Native Media Group. And we will give each panelist about 5 minutes to talk, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So Kristen, if you want to get us started.
Sure. So good morning or good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining this panel. Just to give you a little bit more background on myself, my name is Kristen Tim. I work at the International Arctic Research Center at UAF, where I study science communication and teach science communication, and this is after having a long career in science communication practice. And so I wanted to start off, because it's always useful to start off with some definitions. So what do we mean by social media? So social media can be defined as interactive technologies, websites, platforms, applications that facilitate the creation and sharing of content, information, ideas, thoughts, interests, or other forms of expression through virtual communities and networks. And there's kind of four main characteristics of social media that are important to emphasize when we start to think about how we'll use it for engagement. So first, it's important to remember that content is user-generated. So of course, this comes with a variety of benefits and pitfalls. On one hand, anyone can jump into the conversation and share their voice or perspective. But on the other hand, this has led to some malicious activities and unhelpful content such as misinformation. The second key characteristic is that it's interactive. So the way interactions occur and the norms around these interactions vary across different platforms, but many of the benefits that come from using social media relate to the potential to have a dialogue. Third is that it's often networked, and so just like people may be in networks of families or workplaces or communities, networks form on social media around followers, hashtags, or in other self-organized communities of users. And this is really important because the quality of your network really affects your ability to communicate with different audiences. And then finally, it's worth remembering that while the interactions are driven from the bottom up, these platforms are usually maintained by organizations with their own sets of goals, and they're able to constrain or enable communication on their platform in important ways, which are useful to understand. So next slide. So with all of these things in mind, there's a lot of good reasons to communicate about science on social media. And so first off, people are going online for science and health information. So according to the National Science Board, approximately 47% of Americans look to the internet for news about science and technology in 2014. And so this is a trend that has likely only increased since then. It's also really important to note that as our media options have proliferated, media have become less mass and more individualized. And so social media enables engagement directly with niche audiences, which is useful because as a communicator, you can more narrowly focus your content, and that enhances your ability to connect with a particular audience. It also enables scientists to engage and converse directly versus through a mediator like a journalist. Most platforms enable two-way communication, and this can be especially useful when it comes to directly having conversations or answering people's questions. And so AMAs, or Ask Me Abouts, are one popular way to kind of facilitate this kind of dialogue online. There's also a relatively low bar for entry in social media, which can be especially useful for early career scientists who are working on, forming relationships or, building a reputation. Early career scientists might have access to networks that might otherwise not have been very accessible. And then finally, it can help your science. So There's been several studies now showing how papers that are shared on Twitter are usually cited more often. But the networking aspect of these platforms are really great spaces to form connections with new partners or collaborators, and the discussions that you have in these platforms might be the seeds for new research projects. Next slide. So if you're just getting started, it's important to note that different platforms facilitate different kinds of communication. So it looked from the poll that a lot of folks here today are pretty familiar with social networking, such as LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. And this kind of functions more like a dinner party, where you can have multiple connections and conversations at once. But other platforms have other kind of key purposes. So some platforms might be more like focused on content creation. And so this might more closely resemble kind of a town square feel, where you can have one-to-many forms of communication. And all of these different platforms have different properties that permit a range of social interactions. And so these are important to think about as you're thinking about a platform that you want to use professionally. What's the pace of feedback? Is it fast or is it slow? What's the visual nature? Are you providing a lot of different cues, or is it just text-based? And then what's the kind of language that's used? Is it a really formal space, or is it a more casual space? The basic idea here is to familiarize yourself with the platform and how people interact in that space. And I like to compare this to traveling to a different country. Before you go to another country, you usually take the time to prepare by learning what's happening, how people communicate there, what are the cultural norms, and these different social media spaces can be kind of similar to that. Next slide. So as you're thinking about choosing a platform, what should you consider? And so the first one I want to point out here is think about your goals for the communication. So any communication effort should start with some clear goals or objectives, and it basically should answer the question, what will be different as a result of my communication in this space? Will people think or feel or act differently? Will I form new relationships? Am I trying to start a dialogue? Am I trying to inspire appreciation? So all of these different goals and objectives are valid, but it's important to be intentional and think about why you're there and what you're trying to do in that space. Next slide. And your goals and objectives will help you identify an audience. So who will you reach out to communicate with in order to achieve your goals? And especially in the online context, it's useful to be very specific about who you're trying to reach. And this is because platforms each host distinct communities of people, and many platforms have distinct sub-communities. And so this graph, I think, is really fascinating. Each column is a different social media platform. And then you can see, how different demographics aligned with those platforms' users. And so, for example, we know that Snapchat and TikTok are used by younger adults, while YouTube, for example, has a much more homogeneous group of users. And many platforms enable you to even further micro-target for a specific audience in ways that are unlikely in a more face-to-face communication environment. And so content can be tailored for a specific age group with specific interests in a specific geographical area. It's really a powerful tool. And as you develop an understanding of who your audience is, it's important to find out where they're communicating. So if you're interested in reaching older audiences, you could either put the content where they're already engaging. In this case, Facebook is probably a good guess. And then instead of putting the content on Snapchat and then hoping that they'll eventually migrate over to the app. Next slide. And then we also want to think about what kinds of messages you want to communicate when you're thinking about which platform to choose. And we know that more complex types of communication, for example, those in the upper right-hand corner here, like relationship development or conflict resolution, This requires more focused interaction and more back and forth. So it's kind of higher in the interactivity. It also requires a higher media richness. So in order to have more productive communication on these kinds of things, we need more cues in order to interpret what people are saying more accurately. Whereas Whereas if you're in this kind of lower interactivity and lower cues needed, this is where kind of basic logistic information, news, the basic who, what, when, where, why, how, that's where that kind of fits in, where you need a little bit less richness. And so when you're thinking about your goals, your audiences, and what kinds of things you want to communicate, you might choose platforms that enable more of this rich communication context if you're dealing with conversations towards the upper right-hand corner. And anybody who's engaged with somebody on a debate, about something complex or contentious on Facebook or Twitter, you're probably well aware of how unproductive that can be as a communication space because you're only limited to text. There's no nonverbal expressions, that tone of voice is missing. And so that's a situation where, resolving a conflict or disagreement is much better suited for a richer communication context, like hopping on the telephone or hopping on a Zoom call or meeting face to face versus trying to sort that out on Facebook. So I hope that answers your question, Francisco and Katie, of an example. And next slide. And so just to summarize, I look forward to the questions and discussion, but I just wanted to emphasize that social media is just one of many tools that can support the communication of science. So it again goes back to thinking about your goals and whether it's the right tool for the job. Social media platforms have a huge range of different purposes and cultures and audiences and capabilities. And so think carefully about where you choose to engage and spend your time and how that aligns with your goals. And so ultimately, let your goals and audiences and the complexity of your message dictate which platforms you choose. And I would just, emphasize for anybody who's not familiar, there's a whole career field based on, providing social media content. And so we have classes here at UAF in content creation. If this is a major part of your project, you might consider seeking out, hiring, and supporting communication expertise on your project if social media is a big part of it. And so I think that's it for me.
Awesome. I think it's my turn. I'm a little nervous to go after all of that. So my name is Sarah Eckert. I'm a communication specialist with the NSF Office of Polar Programs. So I am happy to be talking with all of you today, since I hope to be communicating with you and about your work as much as possible. We just had such an awesome breakdown of the different types of social media. This is what I like to call my cheat sheet for giving to those who maybe aren't as familiar with social media and what each is. And I couldn't resist an Arctic fox because he's just so cute and fluffy. So I have been working in government communications for a long time, in particular government social media. And government social media is different than many of you might have in talking about your research. There's some rules we have to follow. There's a bunch of stuff that we have to deal with that can both help and hinder science communication. So the first thing, which I'm going to get off right off the bat, is government cannot use TikTok. It is one of the fastest growing social media platforms out there. It is why TikTok is not on this image here. But governments can't use TikTok. So what we have been doing is trying to utilize the tools within the social media platforms themselves. And these can be really useful to you. You don't want to start a TikTok account because that's going to require a lot of work. Well, you can go to Instagram and you can create a reel. It gives a similar type of look and feel as a TikTok video, but you don't have to have a new platform that you have to manage. So that's just an example. As someone working in government communications, one of the things that I always say is like, my job is to help you guys all communicate your work. That's what I do. I want to hear from the communities, from our PIs, from our offices, anybody who says, I have this amazing work going on. Here's a photo. And it's as simple as finding your point of contact. And so for many of you, it's me, probably all of you, maybe it's me, or other people in the NNA community office that will take that content and they can help amplify it. So if you're not really sure even where to start, having a conversation saying, hey, we have this field project going on. We think it'd be really great on social media, but we're not really sure how to start. My job is to sit and talk to you and say, oh, why don't we do a live event from the field? Will you have, service? So you could do something like that. So in the government, in my role, those are the types of things that I always am looking for. And I'm looking to anybody who wants to talk about their science. One thing that I love about social media in particular, and one thing that I try to emphasize, especially in the government, people struggle, is social media needs to be authentic. If it's not authentic, people can see right through you. And so when I say authentic, what does that mean? If you have a typo, you have a typo. You're a human. We all are. It's okay to think about just acknowledging like, oops, sorry, there's a typo in that tweet. I can't delete it. That's fine. You want to show who you are as a person, as a science team, for example. And the photos are also can be authentic. So this photo that you're putting out, let's say on Twitter, maybe it's not perfectly, symmetrical, and it's not, this beautiful sunset, but it's a photo of people dirty in the field. It's a little, maybe it's got, it's a little tilted. That's okay. That shows that you are there, you are doing the work. And so one of the things I always emphasize is the authenticity that you want for social media. You want people to see you as scientists, as people. And as a government employee, that has always been a challenge because we're government agencies. We are just an acronym that people maybe roll their eyes when they hear. So I'll just kind of give you a bit of an example. Prior to joining NSF, I worked at the Transportation Security Administration. Everyone's least favorite part about flying is going through TSA. And so most of the time people see TSA and they roll their eyes and they're frustrated and they're angry. And so one of the things we worked really hard to do, and in particular on Instagram, is to build a community and to build a voice and a tone that was not what one might expect from a social media platform for the government. So TSA social media, if you're not familiar with, puns and dad jokes and kind of making fun of passengers who think they can bring guns on airplanes still in 2022, and having fun with it has allowed people to look at TSA and say, I understand why you're doing, why you have the, liquids rule, let's take, for example, and they can laugh with us. And really be educated, edutainment, as we always said. So we're entertaining people, but we're also educating. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is accessibility on social media. This is a requirement on government social media accounts. Accessibility is really important. And when I say accessibility, it can include closed captions on video. It can include alt text. And so there's that piece of accessibility. But there's also the sense of, if I'm posting a video on YouTube and my community doesn't have a lot of bandwidth to watch videos, then my content is no longer accessible to the community I'm reaching. So we want to be able to use those considerations and make the proper social media decisions with that understanding. Things like multilingual accounts are very popular in certain areas and in certain communities. And oh, my slide disappeared. I don't know if that was supposed to happen, but that's okay. And so all of these types of things, the closed captioning, that can all be done natively in the social media platforms. I gave this team some like how-to documents on how to add social media in, let's see, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you're not familiar with adding things like alt text or uploading closed captions. So those are for all of you to take and enjoy. And if you ever have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out. I think you have our emails for everybody, or you can get it. So I just want to, with that, turn it over to our next presenter.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Uvla loatang, good morning. Uvanga Kanik. My name is Alice Kaniklen. Inyupiak Gurunga. I'm Inyupiak Utkerving Miu Gurunga. I was born and raised in Utkervik, but I now live and work here on Dena'ina Athabaskan land in Anchorage. Savaktunga kupiarlu kwaarlumi. I now work full-time on my podcast, which is titled Coffee and Clock. You can see it in my background here. Coffee to represent examining, to represent keeping us woke, and kwak to represent examining our topics through an Alaskan Native lens. So kwak is the Inupiaq word for frozen or raw meat or fish. I am so excited to be here today. I apologize, I don't have any slides or anything prepared. I just heard about this event yesterday, so I'm just kind of like sneaking in, hopefully to share a little bit about my story, and about what I do and how I utilize social media to engage with my listeners. So in addition to Coffee and Kwak, I also host and produce a podcast titled Resolve, which is about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Alaska. And then also Alaska Natives on the Frontline, which was a project funded by the Pulitzer Center to highlight the adaptability and the resilience of the Inupiat in the face of climate change. In addition to those two podcasts, I've also worked with a collaborative media platform titled Native Time. And we did a project titled Village City, which connected urban and rural youth throughout Alaska and in terms of identity and culture. So that was really fun. And we're hoping to continue that project this summer with the Humanities Forum with Native Time. And then I kind of on the side, me and my good friend Jackie, who's also part of my Native Time media collaborative, we're kind of doing this after hours podcast that we want to start. It hasn't quite launched yet, but we're working on it. And it's kind of a play on Coffee and Clock, but a more like let your hair down and have fun kind of podcast. I serve on the Library Advisory Board here in Anchorage. I also serve on the Women's Power League of Alaska and then Alaska Native Media Group. And so I'm excited to just share a little bit more about some of my projects here. And the first being Alaska Natives on the Frontline, which I thought was really funny when I was speaking with Megan Sullivan yesterday. I don't know if you guys know her, but she was the one who reached out to me about this, this presentation. And Alaska Natives on the Frontline, me and my partner, like we utilize social media completely with that. And even in how she reached out to me, my friend Jenna Kunz, who's a journalist who was based in Haines at the time, but she's now on the East Coast, but she slid into my DMs, as one would say. And I had no idea who she was. And we met on the airplane to Utqiagvik to work on this project. And the way that we reached out to folks in Utqiagvik was through social media as well. I just kind of reached out over Facebook Messenger to ask if they would be willing to do a podcast episode. I utilized my my reach and my social media network in order to you know, introduce the project, introduce who I am if they didn't know me, although it was my hometown. So, you know, many of the people I either grew up with them or grew up with their kids, whoever we interviewed. And I just thought it was a really great utilization of collaboration between somebody who I had no idea who this person was, Jenna Kunz. And we went on and did this project and ended up winning a really prestigious award, which I'm very proud of. But it's just funny how it all came together and how we utilize social media. So she's, a millennial like I am. And so she found me on social media. She's like, hey, I just read, an article about you a couple of months ago, and I was wondering if you'd like to hop onto this project. I'm submitting a grant for the Pulitzer Center for, and we went from there. And then so I think that it's just our world is becoming such a globalized world. We're able to connect with people across time zones, across cultures, across languages even. So I think that was a really cool way to kind of start the project. And then I also have this idea that there's I always give credit to the Auntie Network, which basically is this, you have to reach out to all of your aunties to share, either news or like if a new podcast episode is coming out, I'm always like, hey, auntie, can you share this with, so-and-so, or I'll interview their niece or nephew and they'll reshare it because they're so proud to share that about their children or their niece or nephew. So don't discount the Auntie Network because that is key. The way that I interact with my listeners mostly is on social media. And I would say mostly on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I kind of pepper in a little bit of personal things. So like a little bit of personality and who I am as a person, because most of my listeners know me as, the Coffee and Clock host, and they hear me speaking. And it's an interesting dynamic because they feel like they know me, even if they don't know me personally. And they, kind of reach out to me and talk to me like they know me. And I'm like, holy cow, I don't even, some people have even reached out to me to, just talk to me as a friend and maybe somebody who needs advice or wants to learn more about a subject or what have you. And so, I kind of, my approach to social media is to share whatever I'm working on, things that I'm really interested in too, like articles or, spotlights or, I remember I worked at Alaska Public Media last summer for a little bit, and I interviewed Kwana Chasing Horse when she was on the cover of Vogue, and that was just reshared and reshared and reshared on social media. And that was a piece that I had written for Alaska Public Media. And they're like, hey, you're being really successful in the kinds of topics that you're covering. And you're getting a lot of engagement. And I think it's because I'm always on social media, just interacting with people that listen, interacting with my listeners, interacting in a personal way, and then also in a professional way, just really share all of the things that I'm working on with Native Time, and then with also Coffee and Clock, Resolve. It's just, I think that with Jackie and Howdy, who is my other partners in Native Time, Jackie Igluluk Lambert, she's from Kotzebue. She had her own magazine. And then Howdis Brown III, who is an award-winning filmmaker here based in Anchorage. And we're all Inupiaq. And so we combined our forces to create Native Time. And I think our reach is like over 10,000 people. And that's just, personal and professional presence on Instagram and social media and Facebook and Twitter. And I think that because the pandemic, occurred, it has made most of us resort to only on, like, look, we're meeting right now on Zoom, it kind of forced us into this online world. And if you're not really present, virtually, then people don't really think that you exist anyway. It's kind of a strange thing, but that's just like the world that we live in now. It's interesting. I haven't really picked up TikTok yet, but I heard that it's like a really great place to like connect with folks. My older sister, Patuk Glenn, she is the executive director of the Arctic Slope Community Foundation, and she's like TikTok famous. Like she's been out and about, and she shares, like we were just talking about education, entertainment. I heard somebody say she does that. She goes in and she shares a little bit about Inupiaq culture, what it's like to live in the Arctic, but from an education standpoint, so that we have more of that representation of Alaska Native people in social media, and to let them know, this is what an ice cellar is. This is where we store our food throughout the year, because the ground is frozen and it's permafrost. But yeah, so I think that it's always been an important part of our culture to be in connection with one another, to have this open line of communication, and it works both ways, so that we're able to share information with one another, and connect with each other personally, because I do think that in many ways that personal touch, that personal connection to people, especially during the pandemic, is so important. It's just a way of connecting, and I think that it's a little bit missing in journalism even today, right? The way that the relationship building, the trust that you have between one another. But yeah, so thank you for allowing me to share a little bit about, what I do. And I want to just leave and close with this expression that I heard in college. It was the medium is the message, which was an expression coined by Marshall McLuhan in the 60s. I think it was 1964. From his book called The Extensions of Men. And so what that means, the medium is the message. How you are communicating your information is just as important as what you're actually communicating. So I'll leave that with you and open it up for some Q&A.
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, you are welcome to unmute and ask them. I know there's already been a lot of question answering happening in the chat, which is great, but we will open it up now.
A question or seeking advice. So I have had jobs in the past where I do have to be on social media a lot. I've had outreach jobs. Now that I'm safely ensconced in academia, it was very beautiful to leave behind Facebook and lurk occasionally on Reddit and really have no social media presence. And I have relied on my co-conspirators, the more social scientists, instead of me as a introverted engineer on our team, to do the social media outreach for our community work on the NNA grant we have. How do you recommend somebody who finds a lot of peace and solace in their work, their life works really well without social media, much better than when they are engaged in it? How do you use it for work, keep those boundaries? My personality is all or nothing. So when I was using Facebook for work, I spent a lot of time on Facebook, and that wasn't super healthy to my personal life. So any advice there?
Ooh. I will say, so my recommendation is to find partner organizations that you can work with that have active social media, so that you don't have to be on the social media, but could feed content or stories to them, so that they can handle the posting. You don't have to be on social media, because I definitely understand it gets really overwhelming really, really quickly. Spending a lot of time on social media. So that would be my recommendation. If you find those partners, those champions, those other offices that you can just say, hey, here's the latest story. Here's the latest project. Here's the latest publication.
I would say I adhere to this adage or whatever. I think that social media is a tool. It's not a life. It's not a social life. It's a social tool. So as long as you're utilizing it as a tool, and once it becomes, a hindrance, or it's not working the way that you want it to, then just step away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would add to what the others said, that it's not for everybody, and that is okay too. If you prefer, having other kinds of communication with people, you like doing other kinds of activities to share your work. Like, there's a lot of different ways out there to share. And and have conversations and engage, with people. And so if social media is not your jam, like, then that's okay too. Because I think, it's like most things, you put in what you get out, and so, or you get out what you put in. And so if you can only do a handful of activities, then, where can you put your energy to actually have the impact that you want to have, versus being spread thin and not committing to any one particular platform or means of communication. Because there, like Alice had talked about, there's definitely a value to sort of being present, and sharing, because then people see you there, and then you're more likely to sort of have those more organic conversations, versus if you're just posting, a few times a year.
Awesome. Thank you everybody for your responses. I appreciate it.
We got a question. What balance do you think there is to be found between peppering personality and authenticity while staying professional in a science and community building context?
Is that for me because I talked about that, I guess?
For anyone who wants to answer.
Start slow. That's what I say. Start slow. It took years to build up certain, the ability to take certain liberties when it comes to having fun on social media, but it really requires the buy-in of your followers to not kind of push you back, right? So I'm taking my experience at TSA as an example. Maybe you start with like, oh, we're just going to do like a funny pun at the beginning, and then like be super serious, and people are like, oh, that's so funny, and you start getting the feedback from your followers, and then you can slowly build that up that way that they're just like, oh, we got this. So for example, when COVID hit, we were told like, all right, stop with the funny, nothing, it's gotta go serious, full serious. And what happened was, kind of once we got a little past that, and our leadership was like, okay, you can kind of start reintroducing some of that joking tone. Our followers are like, oh my God, you're back. Thank God. I've been waiting for your puns to come back. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So you can get to the point where people are expecting that from you. And if you don't do it, they're like, what's wrong? Are you okay? But it really takes a lot of slow and thoughtful work to do that. And that would be my recommendation, is just start slow and kind of see and practice. For the most part, social media is assuming you're not like gonna offend, Beyonce, you're probably fine. If you post something and it doesn't work, and then you try something else. There's always another tweet coming out. So it's relatively forgiving. I say that relatively because we all know that there are things that can go horribly wrong, but let's say for the most part, not as much of an issue.
In all honesty, like, I've just been expecting to be canceled someday, because I am not using it professionally. You know what I mean? I have that candor and that relationship with my listeners and the people that I have on my podcast enough to be, I guess, like, kind of wiggle around it. But I mean, I wouldn't say take my advice on that, because I've just been waiting to get canceled ever since I started. And it's just, I feel like it's almost like a rite of passage at this point to be canceled on social media. But I know I've learned my boundaries, like on Twitter, like, don't get into arguments anymore, or like, it's not worth it. So I steer clear of those, and I just use it, for fun and for sharing the podcast episodes. But yeah, I think that if you want to stick to it professionally, that also has its pitfalls too, because social media is so fun and so, engaging. And so if you're a little bit dry, it could be a little just kind of, I don't know, maybe not fun for folks to like follow you.
Like if you're just gonna, repost the title of your latest paper that's like the effects of CO2 in the, permafrost levels, like, I'm not gonna lie, I'm already a little bored. but we don't want that. We want you to say, this is like, how is CO2 like being released into the air, and how is that impacting climate change? Check out my latest paper. That's authentic. That's who you are. That's how you would explain something to someone else who's not in your field.
Yeah, and I would add, I think organizations and projects are especially guilty of this because they're kind of tweeting from a place of nowhere. And so if you're thinking about, your project as like, having a Twitter account or something like that, how can you bring like a human being into that? And so is it having like a takeover occasionally where you show a real person's face and they give their voice to your account? Because almost every like organization I follow on Twitter, I just went through and unfollowed a whole bunch because they're just retweeting like their newsletter items, and it's just not very interesting. And I would also add, a lot of these platforms have ways to sort of look at the back end and see which posts do really well or which don't. And so you can start to sort of do a little bit of experimentation within your own feed. If I share a little bit more of my personality in this post, like, do I get more engagement versus when I just share something, like a fact from a paper or something. So you can experiment a little bit and see what works for you, what your followers are really, enjoying. And so think of it from an adaptive mindset and a learning mindset, I think is another important idea.
All right, thought we could wrap up Q&A, maybe with each panelist giving their tips for best connecting with Arctic communities. And we want to respect everyone's time, so we'll end with that question, and then we can hang out a little bit after time in case people have other questions.
I would say what was really successful for our Alaska Natives on the front line of climate change project was collaboration. So Jenna was a traditional journalist where she was writing for a paper in Haines, and she reached out to me as not just somebody who is interested in covering climate change, but someone who's from the community. I'm from Utqiagvik. I grew up there. I know folks there. So it was a really great partnership in the sense that I could ask people questions, how I would approach the questions. And then she, as kind of a journalist and maybe, kind of schooled on how to properly communicate that information in journalism, had her own approach to asking questions. And we kind of covered all the bases in that way, so that it was celebrated by the community and then also celebrated in traditional journalism. So I would say link up with somebody from wherever you would like to cover or go or research or get to know, and work with somebody from that, somebody who knows other people. I think that is super important in terms of not helicopter reporting, number one, and just being mindful of who are the stakeholders in those communities and taking their perspective into consideration.
I would say my biggest advice is knowing if social media is even the right tool. It might not be for your community, for who you're trying to serve, and who you're trying to reach out to. And so being able to say, you know what, this may not be the best way to reach out is really critical. There ends up being a lot of senior leadership. Oh, just put something out on Twitter. How hard could that be? But if they're not reaching your folks, it's not worth it. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, and I would add, some of the best practices you have from any communication environment apply to social media too. I have learned a ton just listening to people on social media and learning about, the things that are happening and what, perspectives people have on different issues across Alaska. And some of the most successful, Facebook groups that I've heard of, they're based on this two-way dialogue and, where people in the communities might be sharing photos and then having a discussion about what's happening. I know the National Weather Service has been really great in this space. So just always remember that that listening and dialogue are key parts of social media. It's not just a platform for one-way blast out of information.
Great. Thank you so much for the lively conversation. We have one more Mentimeter question for everyone. We want to know what topics you are interested in for future BIN meetings. We obviously have ideas, but we really want to try and tailor it to what people would like in the future. So you can go to the Mentimeter link again and drop your ideas in there. Let me put the chat. The link in the chat again. And we will be looking through those. So even if you can't answer that now, at some point today would be awesome. And I will turn it back over to Anna.
Thank you, Elise. Thanks to all the panelists. And again, if you have more questions, just stay on for a few more minutes or send them to us. We'll follow up, and we have resources on this page I just put in the chat. A couple more, and here is just quick screen grab of the resources that we put out there, where you can learn just a little bit more about, how do you use these tools effectively in your work, connecting with the Arctic. And Sarah has even shared some of the Excel spreadsheets she uses to clean the data if you want to do reporting to NSF of your social media engagement. So go to that webpage. That's where we post the recording also of this and the slides of this meeting. A couple upcoming opportunities. We have I want to just point to the launch of the new Polar Science Early Career Community Office. There's a call for early career advisory board members. Go to the webpage here of Prosecco to find out more. NSF shared with us a few opportunities for REU and RET supplements. Anyone who has an NSF grant is eligible to put in a request to NSF to bring in students or teachers to support their work in their research. And these are the deadlines that you may be looking at. And then finally, from the BIN community and from the NNA education outreach community, we will have some storytelling and filmmaking workshops this summer. We'll advertise it through the obvious channels and the newsletter. We do also, we have started working on an activity collection. So if you're creating within your project anything, any resources for educators or community members, videos or lesson plans or anything we can share, we are working on curating those, and we'll reach out to each of you to collect them and then just put them on the webpage there in one spot to reach and advertise them to the communities. With that, I just want to say thanks again for the panelists. We are at time here. Quick reminder, if you haven't subscribed to the newsletter, join our Facebook group or join us on Twitter. You can also follow all the panelists on social media. And then we would like to ask if you can give us quick feedback on this meeting with our 1-minute survey. Maybe somebody can put the link in the chat here.